November 20th, 1945. The war had been over for 3 months, yet for 48 Japanese women standing in formation at Camp Seabrook in rural New Jersey, the conflict felt far from finished. They wore faded remnants of their auxiliary uniforms, their faces masks of dignified resignation as American guards processed their arrival. These weren't ordinary prisoners. They were members of the Japanese Women's Auxiliary Service, captured during the final chaotic weeks of the Pacific War. Young women who had served the empire in various capacities, believing until the very end that their cause was righteous. Now they faced an uncertain future in a country they had been taught to hate and fear. What could possibly transform sworn enemies into something entirely unexpected? Before we discover what happened to these remarkable women, tell us where you're watching from in the comments below. The story begins 6 months earlier in May 1945, when the first group of Japanese women prisoners arrived at the hastily converted facility. Unlike the large camps housing male POWs across the American West, this smaller compound in New Jersey housed fewer than 50 women, ranging in age from 19 to 32. They had been captured in the Philippines and Okinawa as Imperial forces collapsed, serving as radio operators, medical personnel, and administrative staff for the Imperial Japanese Army. Lieutenant Sarah Barnes, one of only 3 female officers assigned to oversee the facility, remembered her first encounter with the prisoners with striking clarity. The women descended from the transport trucks with an almost supernatural composure. Despite exhaustion and fear, they maintained perfect military bearing, their backs straight and their eyes forward. They wore what remained of their khaki service uniforms, some still bearing the chrysanthemum insignia they had once worn with fierce pride. Among them was 24-year-old Sumiko Takahashi, a former communications specialist from Tokyo. She had joined the Women's Auxiliary Service in 1943. Convinced she was defending her homeland from Western imperialism. Now standing in an American prison camp, thousands of miles from home, she carried only a small silk pouch containing a photograph of her family and a letter from her younger brother written before he died at Iwo Jima. The first weeks were marked by absolute silence. The Japanese women kept themselves isolated, speaking only in hushed Japanese during meal times. They performed their duties mechanically, their faces revealing nothing of the turmoil within. Lieutenant Barnes noticed how they maintained ritual precision in everything, bowing slightly before meals, folding their thin blankets with geometric perfection each morning, moving through the compound like ghosts haunting their own captivity. But something began to shift as spring turned to summer. It started with gestures so small they might have been missed entirely. Corporal James Henderson, a farm boy from Minnesota who had lost his best friend at Guadalcanal, noticed that one of the Japanese women, a petite figure named Kazuko Inoue, seemed to be struggling with a persistent fever. Despite his own complicated feelings about the enemy, something in her quiet suffering moved him. Without asking permission or explaining his actions to anyone, Corporal Henderson brought Kazuko a cup of hot tea and 2 aspirin tablets from the medical supplies. He set them down on the rough wooden table near her bunk, making eye contact for just a moment before walking away. Kazuko stared at the items as if they might be some kind of trap or trick. She had been taught that American soldiers were brutal barbarians who showed no mercy to their enemies. Yet here was this young man, barely older than her own younger brother would have been, showing concern for her well-being without any apparent motive beyond simple human decency. She reached for the tea with trembling hands, its warmth spreading through her fingers as she whispered a barely audible thank you in heavily accented English. For the first time since her capture, the rigid military posture she had maintained began to soften ever so slightly. Word of such small kindnesses moved through the compound like ripples across still water. Private Daniel Chen, whose parents had emigrated from China before he was born, understood what it meant to be viewed with suspicion, to be seen as perpetually foreign despite his American citizenship. He had volunteered for this assignment specifically because he wanted to prove his loyalty, but what he found in the faces of these Japanese women surprised him. He saw not the fanatical enemies of propaganda posters, but exhausted young women caught in circumstances far beyond their control or understanding. He began teaching basic English phrases to any prisoner who showed interest, using simple drawings and patient repetition when spoken words failed to bridge the gap. Sumiko found herself drawn to these impromptu language lessons. She had studied minimal English in school before the war and discovered she had a natural aptitude for picking up new words and phrases. More importantly, she began to see something in the Americans' faces that contradicted everything she had been taught about them. Instead of hatred burning in their eyes, she witnessed curiosity and something that looked almost like compassion. Instead of the cruelty she had been promised to expect, she observed unexpected moments of genuine humanity that confused and troubled her deeply. The camp itself was sparse but not deliberately harsh. The women slept in wooden barracks with thin mattresses and threadbare blankets. They ate simple but adequate meals in a communal dining hall, the food strange and unfamiliar to their palates. Rice was rarely served, replaced instead by bread and potatoes that sat heavy in their stomachs. They were assigned light work, duties, mainly laundry and kitchen assistance, tasks that kept them occupied but were not deliberately punishing or designed to break their spirits. Lieutenant Barnes watched these early interactions with careful attention. She had been briefed to expect defiance, possible suicide attempts, and complete non-cooperation based on intelligence reports about Japanese military culture. Instead, she observed something more complex and far more interesting. These women were struggling with a fundamental crisis of understanding. Everything they had been told about Americans was being quietly challenged by daily reality, and they had no framework to process this profound contradiction. Summer brought longer days and slightly more relaxed routines to the camp. The Japanese women had settled into their daily patterns, moving through their assigned duties with quiet efficiency. But beneath the surface of routine, something profound was beginning to change in ways both small and significant. The transformation wasn't dramatic or sudden, but rather emerged through accumulated moments of unexpected connection that none of them could have anticipated when they first arrived. Kazuko Inoue, the young medical assistant from Osaka, found herself working alongside the camp's medical officer, Captain William Foster. He was a reserved man in his early 40s who had served in field hospitals across the Pacific. He had every reason to harbor resentment toward Japanese prisoners, having treated countless American casualties from battles against Japanese forces. Yet when he observed Kazuko's careful attention to cleanliness and her gentle handling of medical supplies, he saw something that transcended national boundaries. He saw a natural healer, someone whose instincts aligned with the fundamental calling of medicine, regardless of which flag she had once served. Captain Foster began teaching her basic medical terminology in English, pointing to bandages, antiseptics, and instruments while pronouncing their names slowly and clearly. Kazuko repeated each word carefully, her pronunciation improving with each session. More significantly, he allowed her to assist with minor procedures, demonstrating proper techniques for dressing wounds and taking vital signs. For Kazuko, these moments represented something she had never experienced before. She was being treated not as a defeated enemy or a burden to be managed, but as someone whose skills and potential contributions actually mattered to another human being. Hideko Mori, the 26-year-old administrative clerk from Kyoto, discovered an unexpected connection with Lieutenant Barnes. Hideko had managed complex record-keeping systems for her military unit in the Philippines, maintaining meticulous documentation despite increasingly chaotic conditions as Japanese forces retreated. When Lieutenant Barnes noticed her examining the camp's filing system with obvious professional interest, she made a decision that surprised even herself. She asked Hideko through gestures and Tomiko Saito's halting translation if she would be willing to help reorganize the administrative records that had fallen into disarray during the rapid expansion of the facility. Hideko accepted the assignment with visible eagerness. For weeks, she worked methodically through stacks of papers, creating logical systems and cross-references that made information readily accessible. Lieutenant Barnes watched with growing respect as this former enemy soldier demonstrated organizational skills that exceeded those of most American administrators she had worked with during her military career. More importantly, she observed how Hideko's entire demeanor changed when she was engaged in meaningful work. The mask of resigned defeat lifted, replaced by focused concentration and something that looked almost like quiet pride in her contributions. These individual connections began creating ripples throughout the entire compound. Other women noticed that Kazuko and Hideko were being treated with respect rather than contempt, that their contributions were valued rather than merely tolerated. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the rigid wall of silence and separation between captors and prisoners began developing small cracks. September brought cooler temperatures and the first hints of changing leaves to the New Jersey countryside. For the Japanese women, the shifting seasons marked nearly 4 months in American captivity, 4 months of experiences that had slowly eroded their certainty about everything they had once believed without question. The propaganda they had absorbed about American brutality seemed increasingly hollow when measured against their daily reality, creating a cognitive dissonance that grew more uncomfortable with each passing week. Noriko Arai, the 22-year-old radio operator from Hiroshima, had maintained perhaps the most rigid adherence to military discipline among all the prisoners. She had refused to speak English, declined to participate in any activities beyond mandatory duties, and kept herself deliberately isolated from both her fellow prisoners and the American staff. But in mid-September, something shattered her carefully maintained walls of resistance. A letter arrived through the International Red Cross, the first communication any of the women had received from Japan since their capture months earlier. The letter came from Noriko's aunt in Osaka, one of the few relatives who had survived the firebombing campaigns that had devastated Japanese cities. Written in careful script on thin paper, it described a reality that Noriko had refused to fully accept, despite hearing rumors and reports. Her entire family in Hiroshima had been killed instantly on August 6th when the atomic bomb obliterated the city. Her parents, her 2 younger sisters, her grandparents, the neighbors she had grown up with, the teachers who had educated her, everyone she had known in her hometown had simply ceased to exist in a single blinding moment of unprecedented destruction. Noriko sat alone in the barracks holding that letter, her hands shaking so violently that the paper rustled audibly. She had been told that American weapons were powerful, but she had imagined conventional bombs, traditional warfare that at least allowed for the possibility of survival and shelter. This was something else entirely, something that defied her understanding of what warfare could be. She felt the foundations of her identity cracking apart because everything she had sacrificed and served for had led to this absolute annihilation of everyone she loved. Sumiko found her there several hours later, still clutching the letter, tears streaming silently down her face. Without speaking, Sumiko sat beside her, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. Other women gathered quietly around them, forming a circle of shared grief and confusion. They had all lost so much, but Noriko's loss represented something even more devastating because of its totality and finality. Lieutenant Barnes observed from across the compound, but made no move to interfere with this moment of collective mourning. She understood that some wounds could not be addressed through official channels or military protocols. That evening, Corporal Henderson found Noriko sitting alone in the dining hall long after the other prisoners had returned to their barracks. He had heard about the letter through the informal network of guards who had grown unexpectedly protective of their charges. Without saying a word, He sat down across from her and simply remained present, offering the gift of silent companionship in the face of unspeakable loss. October arrived with crisp air and brilliant foliage that painted the New Jersey landscape in shades of gold and crimson. For the Japanese women, the spectacular autumn colors represented something both beautiful and melancholy, a reminder of seasons changing back home in a country they might never see again. The routines of camp life had become familiar, even comfortable in their predictability, but nothing could have prepared them for what Captain Mitchell announced during the morning assembly on October 15th. Captain Robert Mitchell stood before the assembled prisoners with Lieutenant Barnes at his side, holding a clipboard and wearing an expression that the women had learned to recognize as important. Through Tomiko Saito, who had become the unofficial translator for all major announcements, he delivered news that left the Japanese women staring at him in complete bewilderment. In approximately 6 weeks, on the fourth Thursday of November, the camp would be celebrating an American holiday called Thanksgiving. The Japanese women would be invited to participate fully in the celebration, including a special meal that would be prepared in their honor. The translation hung in the air like an incomprehensible riddle. Tomiko herself struggled to find adequate Japanese words to explain the concept because Thanksgiving had no direct equivalent in Japanese culture. She attempted to describe it as a harvest festival combined with a day of gratitude, but even this explanation seemed insufficient to capture what the Americans were proposing. The women exchanged confused glances, uncertain whether this announcement represented some kind of test or trick they were failing to understand properly. Shizuko Nishimura, the 28-year-old senior officer from Nagasaki, raised her hand hesitantly to ask a question. Her English had improved considerably over the months, though she still struggled with complex concepts and unfamiliar vocabulary. "Captain Mitchell," she began carefully, measuring each word, "this Thanksgiving, it is holiday for American people to celebrate victory over enemies? We are to watch Americans celebrate our defeat?" Her question reflected what many of the women were thinking, that this invitation was actually a subtle form of psychological warfare designed to emphasize their status as conquered enemies. Captain Mitchell shook his head firmly, and Lieutenant Barnes stepped forward to provide clarification. "No," she said gently, speaking slowly so Tomiko could translate accurately. "Thanksgiving is not about victory or defeat in war. It's about gratitude for what we have and sharing abundance with others. It's about sitting down together as human beings, not as enemies, and acknowledging our common need for food, shelter, and community." She paused, letting Tomiko translate before continuing. "We want to share this tradition with you because you are here with us, and because we believe that even in difficult circumstances, there are things worth being grateful for together." The explanation only deepened the women's confusion. They had been taught that Americans were individualistic and selfish, concerned only with their own prosperity and pleasure. This concept of sharing abundance with prisoners, with defeated enemies who had nothing to offer in return, contradicted everything they understood about how victors were supposed to treat the vanquished in warfare. The weeks leading up to Thanksgiving were filled with unprecedented activity throughout the camp. Mrs. Dorothy Hayes, the head cook who had fed soldiers and prisoners with equal portions of competence and complaint for nearly 2 years, found herself transformed into something resembling a general preparing for a major campaign. She had been given authorization to prepare a traditional Thanksgiving feast that would serve both the American staff and all 48 Japanese prisoners, a directive that initially struck her as somewhere between peculiar and mildly insane. Mrs. Hayes was a practical woman in her 50s from Pennsylvania Dutch country, where food represented both sustenance and communication in ways that transcended language barriers. She approached this assignment with the same serious determination she brought to all her work, ordering supplies through proper channels and making lists that grew longer each day. Turkeys, sweet potatoes, cranberries, pumpkins for pies, ingredients for stuffing and gravy, everything needed to create an authentic American Thanksgiving meal that would feed nearly 100 people properly. What surprised everyone was when several of the Japanese women approached Lieutenant Barnes with a hesitant request. Sumiko served as their spokesperson, her English now confident enough to handle complex negotiations. "Lieutenant Barnes, we would like to help prepare this Thanksgiving meal. We do not understand this holiday fully, but we understand that food preparation is important work. We would be honored to contribute our labor to this celebration you are sharing with us so generously." Lieutenant Barnes brought the request to Mrs. Hayes, expecting resistance from the notoriously territorial cook. Instead, Mrs. Hayes considered the proposal for a long moment before nodding decisively. "Bring them to my kitchen," she said simply. "Anyone willing to work hard and follow instructions is welcome at my table, regardless of where they come from or which side they fought for during this terrible war." The following week became a revelation for everyone involved in the preparations. Kazuko and Hideko found themselves working alongside Mrs. Hayes, learning to prepare dishes they had never encountered before. The cook demonstrated how to make proper bread stuffing with sage and onions, how to prepare candied sweet potatoes with marshmallows, how to create smooth gravy from turkey drippings and flour. She showed them the precise technique for crimping pie crusts and the proper consistency for cranberry sauce. The Japanese women brought their own meticulous attention to detail and their cultural respect for food preparation as an almost sacred act. Mrs. Hayes watched with growing approval as they treated each ingredient with careful consideration, wasting nothing and maintaining spotless work areas without being told. Sumiko proved particularly adept at understanding cooking techniques, asking thoughtful questions about why certain steps were performed in specific orders. Kazuko's steady hands and gentle precision made her naturally suited for delicate tasks like decorating pies and arranging serving platters beautifully. But beyond the practical work of cooking, something more profound was happening in that kitchen. The women were learning about American culture through its food traditions, understanding that this Thanksgiving celebration represented values of abundance, generosity, and the importance of gathering together despite differences or difficulties. November 22, 1945 arrived with cold sunshine and crystalline blue skies. The dining hall had been transformed overnight by American soldiers and Japanese prisoners working together in ways that would have been unimaginable just months earlier. Long tables had been arranged in rows and covered with white sheets that served as makeshift tablecloths. Simple autumn decorations made from dried leaves and branches collected from the surrounding woods created centerpieces that brought warmth to the utilitarian space. The morning had been consumed by final preparations in the kitchen. Mrs. Hayes orchestrated the timing of multiple dishes with military precision, calling out instructions, while Sumiko, Kazuko, and Hideko moved efficiently between stations. The turkeys had been roasting since before dawn, filling the entire camp with an aroma that was simultaneously foreign and somehow universally appetizing to everyone who smelled it. Sweet potatoes bubbled in their candied glaze, mountains of mashed potatoes waited in enormous pots, and pies cooled on every available surface. At precisely 1 o'clock in the afternoon, Captain Mitchell stood at the entrance to the dining hall and rang a bell to signal that the meal was ready. The Japanese women filed in quietly, still uncertain about what this celebration truly meant or how they were expected to behave. They had been instructed to sit wherever they wished, rather than in their usual segregated section, but most gravitated toward each other out of habit and lingering discomfort with this unprecedented mixing of prisoners and guards. What they saw on the tables made several of them gasp audibly. The abundance was staggering, almost incomprehensible to women who had spent months eating simple rations and who knew that, back in Japan, their countrymen were starving in the ruins of bombed cities. Whole roasted turkeys, golden and glistening, sat on large platters at intervals along the tables. Bowls overflowed with mashed potatoes, stuffing, green beans, candied sweet potatoes, and cranberry sauce. Fresh bread rolls were piled high in baskets, and butter sat in small dishes beside them. Noriko Arai, who had been so devastated by news of her family's death just weeks earlier, stared at the feast with tears streaming down her face. But these were not tears of grief alone. They were tears of confusion, of guilt, of overwhelming emotion at witnessing such generosity directed toward people who had been enemies. She whispered to Shizuko beside her, "How can they give us this? How can they share such abundance when our bombs killed their soldiers, when our country attacked them without warning?" Before anyone could respond, Captain Mitchell stood to address the gathering. Lieutenant Barnes stood beside him while Tomiko prepared to translate his words carefully. "Today is Thanksgiving," he began, his voice carrying across the silent hall. "It's a day when Americans traditionally gather to give thanks for our blessings and to share what we have with others. The tradition started centuries ago when early settlers to this country were helped by native people who shared their harvest when the newcomers were starving and unprepared for the harsh winter ahead." Captain Mitchell continued, pausing frequently to allow Tomiko to translate his words into Japanese for those still struggling with English comprehension. Those early settlers had every reason to be suspicious of the native people they encountered, just as those native people had reason to be wary of the strangers arriving on their shores. But they chose to see each other as human beings in need, rather than as threats to be feared. They chose to share a meal together, to break bread as a symbol of peace and mutual survival. He gestured to the laden tables before them. "Today we share this meal not to celebrate victory or to emphasize defeat, but to acknowledge that we are all human beings who have survived a terrible war. We share this food because America has abundance, while your homeland faces starvation and devastation. We share this meal because it is the right thing to do, because mercy and generosity should not end when the fighting stops." His voice grew softer, more personal. "Many of us in this room have lost friends and family members in this war. We have all been touched by violence and death. But today, we choose to sit together and give thanks that we are alive, that we have survived, and that we have the opportunity to build something better than the hatred that brought us to this moment." The translation finished, and silence filled the hall for what felt like an eternity. Then Shizuko Nishimura stood slowly, her military bearings still evident despite months of captivity. She bowed deeply to Captain Mitchell, holding the bow longer than protocol required. When she straightened, her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "Captain Mitchell," she said in her careful English, "we do not deserve this kindness. Our country brought great suffering to America and to many nations. We believed lies and served evil purposes we did not fully understand. Yet you treat us not as the enemies we were, but as the human beings we are trying to become." Other women began standing as well, bowing to the American staff members scattered throughout the room. It was a moment of collective acknowledgement, of accepting both their past actions and their present transformation. Sumiko stood and added her own words, her voice steady despite obvious emotion. "In Japan, we have a concept called on, which means a debt of gratitude that can never be fully repaid. Today, you have given us on that we will carry for the rest of our lives. We can never repay the mercy you have shown us, but we can try to honor it through how we live from this day forward." Mrs. Hayes, watching from the kitchen doorway, wiped her eyes with her apron and muttered something about onions before disappearing back into her domain. Corporal Henderson found himself unexpectedly moved, remembering his anger when he first learned he would be guarding Japanese prisoners. Private Chen stood quietly, thinking about his own parents' journey to America and the kindness of strangers that had made their survival possible. "Captain," Mitchell gestured for everyone to be seated. "Then let us eat together," he said simply. "Let us be grateful together for this food, for this moment of peace, and for the possibility that even enemies can become something better when they choose understanding over hatred. The meal itself became an experience that transcended simple eating. American soldiers demonstrated how to carve turkey and explained the purpose of each dish on the table. The Japanese women tasted flavors completely foreign to their palates, some finding them strange but pleasant, others struggling with the sweetness of candied yams or the unusual texture of cranberry sauce. But every woman made the effort to try everything offered, understanding that this gesture of trying represented something far more significant than mere politeness about unfamiliar food. Kazuko sat beside Corporal Henderson, the young man who had first shown her kindness months ago with tea and aspirin. Through a mixture of English, Japanese, and elaborate hand gestures, they managed to have a conversation about their families and their homes. Henderson showed her a photograph of his farm in Minnesota, pointing out the barn where he had learned to care for animals and the fields where he had worked beside his father since childhood. Kazuko described Osaka before the firebombing, the bustling streets and the small restaurant her family had operated for 3 generations, a place that no longer existed except in memory and photographs. At another table, Hideko found herself in conversation with Lieutenant Barnes about the nature of duty and service. "I joined the Women's Auxiliary because I believed I was protecting Japan," Hideko explained slowly, choosing her English words carefully. "I thought Americans wanted to destroy our culture and enslave our people. Everything I did because I believed it was righteous and necessary for our survival as a nation." She paused, looking down at her plate. "Now I understand that I was serving leaders who lied to us, who used our loyalty and our love of country to commit terrible crimes. How do we live with that knowledge? How do we forgive ourselves for being so blind?" Lieutenant Barnes considered the question seriously before responding. "I think," she said slowly, "that forgiveness begins with acknowledging the truth, no matter how painful that truth might be. You cannot change what you did when you believed lies, but you can choose what you do now that you know the truth. That choice, made every day, is what defines who you truly are." She looked around the dining hall at the unprecedented scene of former enemies sharing a meal in peace. This moment right here, this willingness to sit together and see each other's humanity despite everything that has happened, this is what redemption looks like when people choose it consciously. As the meal continued, something remarkable happened spontaneously and without any official planning or direction. Tomiko stood and began speaking in Japanese, then translating her own words into English so everyone could understand her message. "We would like to express our gratitude in a traditional Japanese way," she said. "In our culture we have a saying, 'Itadakimasu,' which we speak before eating. It means more than just 'let us eat.' It means, 'I humbly receive this food and recognize all the lives and efforts that made it possible.' We say it to honor the plants and animals that gave their lives, the farmers who grew the food, and the cooks who prepared it with care." She looked around at her fellow prisoners. "Today we say, 'Itadakimasu,' not just for the food, but for the mercy we have received, for the kindness that has transformed us, and for the hope that we might deserve the second chance we are being given." The Japanese women responded in unison, "Itadakimasu," their voices creating a moment of ritual acknowledgement that transcended language barriers. The afternoon stretched into evening as the Thanksgiving celebration continued far beyond the meal itself. Tables were pushed aside to create space, and someone produced a radio that filled the hall with music. American soldiers attempted to teach Japanese women how to dance to swing music, resulting in laughter and stumbling steps that broke down remaining barriers of formality and distance. Mrs. Hayes emerged from the kitchen with the pies she had been keeping warm, cutting generous slices that disappeared almost as quickly as they were served. But as the celebration wound down and women began returning to their barracks, the weight of unresolved questions settled over the camp once again. The war was over, but their future remained uncertain. repatriation procedures for Japanese prisoners were complicated by the complete devastation of their homeland and the ongoing American occupation. Many of the women had still not received any word about whether their families had survived the war's final brutal months. They existed in a strange limbo, no longer quite prisoners, but not yet free to determine their own destinies. 3 weeks after Thanksgiving, on December 15th, Captain Mitchell received official orders from the War Department regarding the Japanese women prisoners. The orders were characteristically bureaucratic, but contained unexpected flexibility given the unprecedented circumstances these particular prisoners represented. All women would be offered repatriation to Japan through displaced persons processing centers being established in Tokyo and Yokohama. However, those who could demonstrate compelling reasons to remain in the United States temporarily could apply for special status as displaced persons with potential pathways to eventual immigration. The announcement created turmoil among the women. They gathered in small groups, speaking in urgent whispers as they debated options that all seemed impossibly difficult. Return to a devastated homeland where they might find nothing and no one. Waiting, or remain in America, the enemy country that had shown them unexpected mercy, but where they would always be marked as former enemies. Sumiko found herself at the center of these discussions, her natural leadership qualities having emerged over the months of captivity. She had been corresponding with the Henderson family, who had extended an offer she never imagined possible. They would sponsor her immigration application if she chose to remain in America, providing housing and assistance while she sought employment as a translator. Mrs. Henderson, moved by Sumiko's obvious intelligence and genuine remorse about her country's actions, had written, "You have a gift for bridging cultures and languages. America needs people like you to help us understand how to build peace rather than simply win wars." Kazuko faced a different decision. Dr. Foster had arranged for her to continue medical training at a hospital in Philadelphia if she chose to stay, recognizing her natural talent for healing work. But Kazuko's aunt in Osaka, one of her few surviving relatives, had written begging her to return and help care for war orphans flooding the devastated cities. "We need every pair of hands, every person willing to help rebuild what was destroyed," her aunt had written. "Your skills are desperately needed here among your own people." Noriko Arai, who had lost everything in Hiroshima, faced perhaps the most agonizing choice of all. She had nothing to return to in Japan, no family waiting, no home still standing, no community that remembered her existence. Yet the thought of remaining in America felt like a betrayal of everyone who had died, as if she were abandoning their memory by accepting comfort from the nation that had obliterated her entire world in a single atomic flash.